Okay, I'm going to drop this second argument that says the New Testament is in the right place, right time, fulfills the criteria for historiography. Now, from this point on, I'm going to be doing my minimal facts argument. I'm going to be citing only data. Probably 95% of what I say from now on will be accepted across the critical spectrum, from conservative scholars to atheist scholars who study these disciplines. They're all going to agree with almost everything I'm saying here. What makes Bart Ehrman say that we can get Paul's report from just plus 25? What makes Bart Ehrman say that we've got plenty of material from 1 to 2 years after the cross? How in the world can a guy who is, quote, an agnostic leaning toward atheism, how can he say we can get this material back to plus 1 or plus 2? All right. So Paul is writing here, 1 Corinthians 15. There's no difference on the date. Some people might say 53, some people might say 57, but it's not determined by whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever. About 55, it's a nice round 25 years. But Paul says, first 2 verses, when I came to you Corinthians, this is the message I gave you. In other words, when he came to them, he said it, and now he's writing it down. When did he come to Corinth? Some people think that this is the most ascertainable date in the entire New Testament. 51 AD, 51 to 52. How do we know that? Well, because the New Testament mentions a city leader who was in control of Corinth when Paul came to Corinth. And an inscription has been found in stone with this guy's name on it, and how convenient. These city leaders, city-states, remember, in Greece, they were chosen for 1-year terms. And it's known that he ruled the city from 51 to 52 AD. And when Paul came, he was in control. All right, so Paul says, I'm writing to you here what I said to you here at plus 21. And he says in verse 3, again, I gave you what I was given as of first importance. We're talking about the heart of Christianity right now, he says, and I'm telling you what I was told. Okay, interesting. Here's the question. When and from whom did he receive this material? Do we have a clue? When and from whom did he receive this material? All right, we can talk about the arguments if you want to. I'm not sure how long I'm here afterwards till I get carted off to do something else. But if you want to talk about reasons, we can talk about them. But let me give you the scholarly, the critical conclusion. Bart Ehrman's going to agree to this. People who don't even think Jesus lived, which are like not on the... Bart Ehrman just wrote a whole book against them, saying, you guys don't have credentials, you're out of your field, stay in your own field. That's a skeptic writing to the skeptics. It's kind of a fun read. You have to tell you about their arguments, but virtually everybody, Richard Bauckham, Cambridge University, says this is a consensus position among scholarship. They believe Paul received this material about 35 AD. You go, what? Plus 5? Yeah, plus 5. How in the world would they know that? Let's do the math. Here's the cross. We're calling it, for a nice round number, we're calling it 30 AD. When did Paul have his Damascus Road experience? Or, for skeptics, when did Paul think Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus? It was either plus 2 or plus 3. Plus 2 or plus 3. Paul says, Galatians chapter 1, an authoritative book, according to the definition I gave you earlier of authoritative. Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, Galatians 1:16, I met Jesus. And then he said, I didn't go running up to Jerusalem to meet those who were apostles before me. I went out into Arabia by myself for 3 years. Now, some people think he was preaching and all kinds of other stuff, but we really don't know. He said, I went off for 3 years, and then I went up to Jerusalem. All right, again, let's do the math. Here's the cross. When does Paul come to the Lord? +2. You say, well, I think it's +3. Great, +3. 3 years later, he goes up to Jerusalem. 3 + 3, 6, 30 AD. Oh, I think he was converted 32 AD. Okay, great. 2 + 3, 35. And in Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, I went up to Jerusalem after 3 years, so we're +5 or +6 after the cross. And Paul says, I spent 15 days with Peter, the head apostle. He said, I saw no other apostles except James, the brother of Jesus. I spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Now, what were they discussing during that time? Well, the theme of the short book called Galatians is the nature of the gospel. It's, I guess maybe we could say this is the theme of Galatians. Here's the gospel. Get it right. Don't change it. If you change it, you're anathema. Preach the right thing. Don't try to get there some other way. It's by grace through faith. All right, you got it? Don't mess up the gospel. That's the bottom line. So when he goes to Jerusalem at +5 or +6, if they weren't talking about the gospel centrally, at least had to come up. Now, you know, as a guy who studied the resurrection all my life, and I tell people the resurrection rescued me from 10 years of skepticism. I told my mother from back in those days that I was this close to becoming a Buddhist. I really was. And in fact, some days I think I was, like we were talking about in the car, you know, what side of the fence am I on? I don't know. You know, you're in grad school and you're going through this stuff and a lot of things are going on. And the resurrection kind of rescued me from this. I could see that this argument wins the day. Seriously. All right, so what's going on here? I know what I would ask Peter and James first. This would be my first question to them if I'm the Apostle Paul. I'll tell you what I saw on the way to Damascus if you tell me what you saw a few days after the crucifixion. How did he look? Come on, guys. Give it to me. What did you guys see? Then I'll tell you what I saw. And then I might say this if I'm Paul, depending on how bold Paul is. And, you know, Paul was pretty bold from his epistles. I might have said this. Hey, guys, the three of us have something in common here. I'm not trying to dog you guys, but, you know, we all have a point in our life when we weren't exactly exemplary followers of the Lord. I was on my way to kill or imprison men, women, and children who named the name of Christ. I'm not proud of that. James, you grew up in the house with the Messiah, and you were an unbeliever. Somebody told me you used to think your brother was insane. That's what Mark 3 says, that his family thought he was beside himself. And James might have hung his head and say, I didn't know any better. Peter, you have an exalted position as a head apostle. I'm not trying to dog you, but you denied your Lord 3 times. Now, if I'm writing a book here, I'm going to put an informational footnote. I'm going to say a pastoral note. I'm going to say, look what God does with people who've made a lot of mistakes, and he uses them later. Just a little side note. But if I'm Paul, I'm going to say, guys, tell me, James, dude, you thought he was crazy. What did you think when you saw your crucified and risen brother? And Jesus says to you, bro, it's me. What was the first thought that came into your head? Peter, you must have thought it was wasted. You blew it. You're going back fishing. What did you think when he appeared to you? And guys, let me tell you what it was like for me on the road to Damascus. I mean, what were those 15 days like? There's a little Greek word. Well, actually, it's a long Greek word, but it's in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18. The Greek word is hysteresai. The root word is histor, H-I-S-T-O-R, if you transliterate it. Now, you don't jump off the deep end and say, that's our word history. Well, it is the Greek word from which we get our word history, but it doesn't mean it meant history in the first century. But what does histor or hysteresis mean? The English translations usually slaughter it. I know 2 or 3 word studies on this done by non-evangelicals. It's a very interesting word. It means to interview so as to acquire truth. Probably the closest word we have today to depict this hysteresis. We see it every night, depending on where you live in the country. I used to live in Montana for 3 years, and it was 10 o'clock at night. For most of the country, it's probably 11 o'clock at night. Comes on your television, eyewitness news. The word hysteresis means check it out. It was used in papyri at an early date for people who didn't take persons, words, a geographer. It was used once of a geographer. What's up this river? Well, I'm not going to ask you what's up that river. You might live a mile up, but I'm going to check it out myself. So I go up the river. Then I write my diary. That's hysteresis. That's eyewitness news. And here's Geraldo Rivera out, and Geraldo's always standing in the middle of the hurricane, so you can see that he's really suffering to bring you the news. That's hysteresis. And Paul says, I went back here at +5 or 6 because I wanted to investigate. Then, as we go from the end of Galatians 1 to Galatians 2, no chapter break, he says, 14 years later, I went back. All right. 14 years later, I went back. Critics, Bart Ehrman, Helmut Kirster at Harvard, they put this event at about 48 AD. We're still only +18. He went back, and Galatians 2:2 is one of the most incredible verses in the New Testament. I love the way the King James translates it here, but most translations say just about the same thing. Paul says in Galatians 2:2, I went back up after 14 years to see the other apostles and to set before them the gospel I was preaching, to see if I was running or had run in vain. What? Yeah, I went back up to Jerusalem to make sure we were all on the same page, to make sure we were all presenting the same gospel. Neat. So we do want to make sure that you guys were preaching the same thing. Galatians 2:2, I went back up there. I shared with them the gospel I was preaching. And then just a few verses later, Galatians 2:6, these 5 words in English, they added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. Then just 3 verses later, this is where we get the phrase, they laid hands on Barnabas and me, and they gave us the right hand of fellowship, and they said, y'all go to the Gentiles and take this message. We're going to stay here and give the message to the Jews. But the point is, the message was the same. They added nothing to me. You take it to them, we'll give it here, and that's what we decide to do. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians 15:11, reflecting on this is them telling Paul that he was okay. Here's Paul telling them that they're okay. 1 Corinthians 15:11, he just gives a list of the appearances, and then he says this, whether it is I or they, who are they? They are the other apostles, he says so in the context. Whether it is I or they, this is what we preach and this is what you believe. Paul's saying, hey, you don't like me? Great, go talk to Peter. Don't like Peter? Go talk to James. Because you're going to get the same message no matter who you talk to. Whether it's I or they, so we teach, and so you believe. Next few verses, that's why Paul says 3 times, if we're wrong about this, we're liars. If we're wrong about this, we're preaching in vain. The we're is he and the other apostles. Why? Because they were preaching the same message. It's uniform. All right, one more thing and I'm done. So far I've been focusing on this point right here at 5 to 6 years after the cross. but I'm going to assert that we can get back all the way to the cross. We can close this gap. Why does Bart Ehrman, what I started with, why does Bart Ehrman say we can get this message back to 1 to 2 years after the cross? Why does he concede that? Why do skeptics, why has the table certainly totally changed on this? Because of this creedal argument. And in the New Testament, they can tell that this was early preaching. This is what the earliest apostles preached coming out of the gate. All right. This is when Paul heard the message, hysteresi, Galatians 1:18. This is when he did the first-hand research. Now, if Peter and James gave it to Paul, they had it before he had it. Now, when I say an early creed, one of the reasons they know it's an early creed is because in the Greek, it reads stylistically. 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following reads like this in the Greek. Da 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 da. 2 stanzas with data, and not a rhyming sequence like American, like English, but with a way that's easily memorizable. Why? Because most New Testament scholars today believe that the vast majority of Jesus' audiences, contrary to other things you may have heard, the vast majority of Jesus' audiences were illiterate, up to 90%. What do you do when you teach somebody who's illiterate, but you want them to teach somebody else? What do? You tell stories that they'll remember. Parables. And you give them short, pithy statements that they will memorize. Turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, do unto others, that they will memorize. And when you codify things into a da 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 da, especially if there's an Aramaic original, which is the language Jesus speaks, now we know you're really going back in the church because somebody had to put this together. All right, Paul hears it. They had it before Paul. Someone had to codify it. You had to get it from the events to the da 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 da, and we're right on top of it. In fact, some of the leading scholars today have said the following. Larry Hurtado, just recently retired, head of the religion department at Edinburgh University. Hurtado says, coming out of the gates in 30 AD, Hurtado says 2 doctrines had to be present or there would be no Christianity. What are those 2 doctrines? Deity of Christ and a resurrection. Of course, if there's a resurrection, there's a death. So deity, death, resurrection. That's the gospel. Whenever you hear the gospel defined in the New Testament, writings of Paul or in the book of Acts, that's the minimal gospel presentation. Deity, death, resurrection, and then the question of, do you have faith? And that's what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2. What did you do with that message? Did you believe? First 2 verses, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2. So deity, death, resurrection, belief. And Hurtado says, coming out of the gate, you got that. From Edinburgh. Okay. Richard Bauckham, Cambridge. Same thing. I gave this lecture one time at Cambridge, same lecture, and Richard Bauckham, who's a very prominent scholar, slipped in and was sitting in the back row while I was speaking. And I went ahead and gave him a regular lecture, which took his name in vain several times, and said, Richard Bauckham says you can date it there. He sat in the back. I asked him later, do you have any comments? He said, no, that's what I teach. That is present from 30 to 31 AD. Okay, third guy, James D.G. Dunn, is influential as any historical Jesus scholar today. Dunn says the latest this da 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 form could have been memorized. The latest it would have been put from event into form is 6 months after the cross. That's James D.G. Dunn. Here's the cross. 6 months later, this is in da 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 form. And like I said, the very latest is Bart Ehrman. I started the lecture with it. Bart Ehrman saying we can get this back to, he has other arguments. Bart Ehrman does. Now, To bring this full circle, make a comment or two and I'll be done. What about my professor who said, yeah, go ahead and do the resurrection, but don't say it happened because the New Testament said it happened? And I said, critical scholars use the New Testament, but they use it critically. They don't assume it's inspired or even reliable. They use it critically. How would Bart Ehrman, how would Bart, qua Bart, get that conclusion of 1 to 2 years later? Well, one of the things he does in this book, Did Jesus Exist? He asks, how many independent arguments do we have for the crucifixion of Jesus? Now, the Jesus Seminar, a very critical, very quote-unquote liberal group, says if you have two sources for something, that makes the proclamation a lot greater chance of being historical, because two heads are better than one. Two sources are great. Bart Ehrman asked the question, how many sources do we have for the crucifixion? He gives a list. He cites, to his skeptical mind, the way he does this, he gives 11 sources, 11 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. 11. Now, on ancient historical grounds, why isn't 11 exemplary? When, as Paul Meyer says, professor of ancient history, Western Michigan University, Meyer says many things in the ancient world depend on one witness, and two make an event unimpeachable. Two. Bart Ehrman says we have 11 different sources, historical sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. So here's what you get, bottom line. This phrase will have virtually no disputants in the contemporary world. Jesus' earliest followers had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Virtually nobody disputes that. Bart Ehrman says, no, I don't dispute that. It's determined historically. We know it's true. Why would I say I dispute it? It's just true. So here's what you do. You have that sentence. The earliest followers of Jesus had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus. And what do you do if you're a skeptic? You come up with alternatives. Well, maybe they were lying. Well, maybe they saw hallucinations. But the same data, which I've been given here, the same data which scholars share, say those other theories don't work. And so now you're left with an appearance. And therefore, a lot of skeptics, place we began, a lot of people today who are happy and are often quoted by the skeptical community will say, I'm a skeptic, as Dale Allison does. He was the one I was citing earlier. Dale Allison, who says, I'm a skeptic. He called himself a cryptic deist. And then he says, but I'm sure the risen Jesus appeared to his disciples after his death. I can give you others, but is that the definition? Ed Sanders, E.P. Sanders, Duke University, recently retired from Duke, historian. He gives a list of well-accepted historical events, and he calls himself a liberal. And then he says this in his list of accepted historical facts. He says, the following is an historical fact. The earliest disciples saw the risen Jesus. I don't know how exactly they saw him, but they saw him. That's his list, and that's part of his list. That's one of his facts in his irreducible minimum list. The earliest disciples saw the risen Jesus. How do we get that? Because we have the data that can track it back to the beginning.